Hello everyone, today we talk about the Venetian military both at sea and on land between the 11th and the 13th centuries. It's not the first time we talk about Venetian armies, navy, organization. We already did in fact for the later Middle Ages. This is the first time we do it for this previous era. It's going to be just an introduction because there is really a lot about Venetian warfare that we have never really discussed, especially in this earlier period. We've seen something here and there in the prodromes to the Battle of Dyrrhachium, for example. We, generally speaking, discussed Venetian policy abroad, in trade. We, in general, are acquainted with the nature and the logics of the Italian maritime republics, as we discussed them also in other communes, such as Pisa, for example, Amalfi as well. That is also a bit of a different reality from these central northern Italian ones, the same Genoa. There were actually others. However, Venice was notoriously the most powerful and the most successful one of all, especially because of the particular political unity that the Venetian commune developed. I recently made a video about the mid-14th century Venetian government system, which referred in part to the previous developments. However, that will be also for another sort of, let's say, civilian history video. Today, we really stick to the military organization of the Venetian commune. That is also peculiar for other characteristics of the Maritime Republic that others didn't quite have. I have some series about other Italian maritime communes. Historically, we've seen, for example, peasant warfare to an extent. At least it was just like an evidential history of the peasant commune. We never really talk about the peasant army just per se, but we will at some point in some specific battles. In particular, we know in that case, for example, Pisa had a wide interland, so it operated like a terrestrial power as well, not just in Tuscany, but in Sardinia, that has a wider hinterland that some of the coastal possessions that other, in fact, maritime republics like Venice had. They were mostly either sort of thinner, like Crete for Venice, or sort of savager and rougher, like, I don't know, Corsica, for example. Although Venice never controlled extensive land territories, and this was a purposeful policy to follow, even after her significant victories following the Fourth Crusade, where Venice said to the French basically, okay, you offer me one fort just like for the contribution, the relative contribution to the campaign, but no, I just want ports. I don't want hinterland. I don't care about having a feudal territorial state, inland. Clever choice, also considering how things went for the Latin Empire later on. Maybe with the Venetians on land things would have gone differently, but it is speculative. Her dominance on the seas was the foundation of her success in the Eastern Mediterranean, and not only, but mostly, throughout this period. Venice is a naval power and wants to remain a naval power. Later on, the Venetian terra firma would be established. We're talking essentially the 15th century, even though some important land intervention on the Italian mainland had already occurred. We discussed the 15th century Venetian Condotta army as essentially the most advanced in Europe, together with the ordinances of Charles the Bold of Burgundy. We will not digress on that because it's beyond our timeline here, but in part that sound, rational calculation that the Venetian Senate that basically had locked its own power in by the end of the 13th century, shown throughout Venetian history. By the way, it's not to say that Venice always won, of course, wars, nor that she was even overwhelmingly successful at amphibious operations. But at large, she had a well-deserved reputation of military might, mostly thanks to the political vision of her government. All right, we don't have to make easy determinism. There are people who go around saying, I don't know. In fact, the Venetians were so good at amphibious operations, for example, not more than the average, really. Or since they were on the lagoons, they didn't have strong cavalry. Not really. There is always this almost deterministic geopolitical disturbance in the air that want people just to make a meme out of everything, thinking that things stop there, that political and military complexity is just a matter of personal opinion or something. I will surely make videos about Venetian history illustrating how the obvious is not obvious at all, as a matter of fact. Nevertheless, Byzantines, Germans, other Italians, Saracens, Latin, meaning the Roman, the Latin empires, put in this way, and the Syrian Franks, had really no choice but to recognize the Venetian naval superiority in particular, right? I also made a video about the Venetian navy in the later Middle Ages, so I already gave the essentials in there, but here what we're talking about. This communes basically put everything they have at sea just through private ventures, and they gradually develop some more concentrated form of government that effectively succeeds in just co-opting this aristocracy that already ran the commune into some more compact, cohesive state that in times of emergency, of war, or other need, will be able to put together enough galleys of those that were already at sea, just out of normal trade activities, and that were always accompanied by some military ones. Consider that, of course, Venice was very ahead in maritime military technology. This would be the case for throughout all the era, right? Thus, virtually and concretely allowing for a de facto permanent navy, unlike any other power other than some other maritime republics. Even if you were a big power like France or Egypt, you wouldn't have a fleet normally available, if not some sort of few ships that eventually you had to boost by often hiring admirals, ships, crews like the Genoese. We know that Italian marines were employed as far as the Persian Gulf by the Ilkhanate of Persia, things like this, which we will also have to come back on because it's actually from a Mongol side of the story, a varying, together with the wide amount of, in fact, other Western mercenaries, mostly knights, speaking volumes really about the alleged sort of overwhelming, crashing superiority of the Mongol art of war, whatever. In any case, I already discussed this partly in some video. The Italian maritime republics were thus specializing in this form of naval dominance and competition among each other, so that their standards were excellent, not just because they were incredibly rich, being able to basically occupy any fortified citadels in the various ports across the Mediterranean, and or forcing, given their trade leverage, bigger systems to open, in fact, their markets, their cities to their presence, but also because fighting against one another, they literally had the equivalent of themselves to train with and refine themselves further. No other power had anything even remotely approaching this at sea, both from a quantitative and a qualitative point of view. In military ventures pursued for our own gain, Venice displayed both astuteness and caution, reflecting the aforementioned political wisdom matured by the particular institutional system of the Serenissima. Her expansions often mirrored her trade routes, predictably. They had essentially to secure again coastal control of the ports from which most of the precious resources came from. Consider that, again, these republics are literally moving the entire trade across the Mediterranean between Asia and Europe. So it's an insane amount of wealth that in turn they reinvest in maintaining ships that costs a lot as well, and protecting the cargoes, which will bring to some forms, in fact, of naval business and tactical organization that will be more famous, like in the later Middle Ages. Today we don't just talk about this per se, because everything had yet to become fully, for example, a state, right? Italian communes, we've seen it very often, basically become fully fledged city-states in the 13th century, which is something that the other communes in Europe do not really do. This, of course, mirrors the stepping up of this power's capacities on their own. In fact, as we will learn now, Venice had an army and a fleet equivalent to whichever force a kingdom had, 30,000 men or their equivalent at sea. So, unlike sometimes entire kingdoms, most kingdoms in Europe, as a matter of fact, on a regular basis. Naturally, not even the Venetians would mobilize that too often, but it would be an increasing need, especially in the later Middle Ages. The fiercest opponents of Venice were Genoa and Pisa. At large, this is true, speaking of broader enemies, the Venetians fought with basically anyone if they had to, but most of these clashes were actually against other maritime powers from the Italian peninsula that often took place, by the way, in other countries' waters or even lands. In fact, there was a general disturbance caused by the Latins, namely the Italians at large, when we look at who they actually were by larger numbers, and just because they came from the sea with that de facto monopoly on Mediterranean trade in the same portual cities. Like at some point, by fighting one another, would destroy entire ports, triggering the repression, by the way, of the local governments that, however, could not really do for very long without these Italian merchants and their general supervision of maritime affairs. The most toxic example is, of course, the one with the Byzantine Empire, especially speaking of Venice, that was in many ways the favorite, even though Pisa or Genoa at some point were, at least we speak, before the Fourth Crusade, right, which is also not really a coincidence, and also for the previous power obtained by Venice in the empire up to that conclusion and the imperial switch in favor of Genoa in the later period. The competition among these three entities, Venice, Pisa, and Genoa, was in particular the one between Venice and Genoa, as the latter would become sort of the strongest Italian maritime republic, surpassing Pisa, was so intense that armed clashes were so commonplace, and a sure diplomat could, and frequently did, pit one against the other, because all the other powers are basically trying to negotiate with them some deal while they were fighting against one another. So they were unavoidably involved, sucked into the same feuds, right? You could at some point confiscate the goods of these merchants, but you had at some point to give something back. This happens so often, I don't know, in Egypt, in Aragon. There are all different types of alignments, but the truth is that the Italians are the strongest at sea, and there isn't really anything that you could do without a proper royal navy that basically just Aragon would start having in a serious fashion to counter, especially Genoa, allying themselves with Venice later, especially into the 14th century. Venice's advantageous geographic placement secured her authority over the Adriatic and the Levant, let's say, or at least the more substantial eastern part of the Mediterranean, especially after seizing Constantinople in 1204. since geopolitics does not really exist, it's not just that Venice was successful because of the fact she had grown from out of a lagoon that was basically impossible to besiege. In fact, if not with an equivalent maritime force, then in the 14th century, Genoa will manage to employ, to besiege Venice, losing at the end of the day. It was a mix of causes, primarily moral, because the Venetians were systematically aggressive in a way that the like had never been seen before. And this immediately starts in her history. Really, we will see the rise in the previous centuries between, say, the 9th and the 11th that are really underrated. She has a solid position in the Adriatic, in general, on the Balkan coast, and she has the very strong connection with Constantinople that technically was, up to a certain point, the actual overlord of the Venetian lagoons, even though already by the time of Charlemagne, the Venetians could basically negotiate by themselves with their doge dukes between the Frankish and the Byzantine Empire. Then there is the Chrysobulla of Alexius I in the 80s of the 11th century. These are all stories we've seen also from the Byzantine side of the story, but we will have to come back on them. The son of Charlemagne died in the siege of Venice, right, out of malaria, especially in the lagoons. Just to say how important Venice actually was, even though she did not venture, especially at that point, onto land, more than much, especially in Italy. As I was saying before, there is actually, however, a very interesting military history of Venetian land intervention here and there. Even the papacy at some point waged a crusade against, for example, the Venetian attempt to seize Ferrara. There are some interests in the Po Delta area. Speaking of salt mines, other ports to seize that really the Venetians are tempted to take over. Later on, as you know, there will be that struggle for Zara against the King of Hungary. But the important at large, as we've seen, is to make money from maritime traffic. That's really the first, the most important, most lucrative, the most obvious business that Venice is into. She doesn't really need, other than for some secondary political strategic reasons, to take control of other parts, like of mostly the coastal hinterland. In the western Mediterranean, Amalfi, Pisa, and Genoa alternated in holding power from the 9th through the 13th centuries. Again, we've seen all these cities in the historical regional series. Pisa took the lead from the 11th, and Genoa rose to prominence from the early 12th. Telling the truth, the latter two republics had also been cooperating, even while being antagonistic against one another, ever since they had swept essentially the western Mediterranean from Saracen presence to the Reconquest, for example, backing the Iberian land armies during their siege of coastal strongholds. The papacy had been quite involved itself in the in the weaponization of such fleets that, however, had mostly a Western bias. Of course, all these republics really were present a bit everywhere, just, however, to a different degree. Pisa, Genoa, they all went to the Levant, just like Venice did. You know that later on, again, Venice was still the preponderant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the Genoese had Byzantine backing. They had also colonies in the Black Sea up to the Ottoman conquest, while Venice still controlled some Greek strongholds that were, in fact, more important than the Genoese ones. The reason being that in this time of naval history, there is no way to actually blockade an entire stretch of sea. Like these Italian fleets can ambush each other's convoys, especially in Greece, with all those islets with certain specific choke points. There is all a very empirical awareness of the various whirlwinds, of the various currents that agitate in certain moments of the year, in certain places. As you know, these countries the states will develop a great deal of cartographical expertise. They're really producing the first real maps of the world with important degree of accurate projection. But there is no way to fully blockade the passage of your rival. So you can't sort of try to bleed them white to make them pay, right? They're not also at war all the time, by the way. But there's always going to be some involvement or this or that power in other areas. And at large, they all reached pretty far away places. This aspect is better left to many videos I made about international trade, times probably intercontinental trade, but it tells you by itself how important the sea was for these cities. Venice had a proper public ceremony that was called the marriage with the sea of the Republic, right? So they threw literally a ring into the water, and they renewed this bond with this enormous force of nature that brought to the Republic so much prosperity. The strength of these seafaring republics clearly lay in their navies, though Venice also engaged in sporadic land operations, unavoidably. Furthermore, her vessels are often documented as deploying crews to support sieges, such as at Curzola in 1000, Tyre in 1124, Corfu in 1143, and Constantinople in 1204. These forces are not the only ones out there. The Italian fleets are rented by, for example, the Crusaders that at large do not have ships on their own. Needless to say, the Italians back the Crusades, participated in the Crusades, were crusaders properly from these maritime republics, from the cities of the hinterland. But at large, the commune and its ships were something else. And of course, like it happened also during the Fourth Crusade with Zara and Constantinople, these maritime republics would help the Crusaders in exchange for some military support for making them occupy some specific strongholds, so that they would have, since the Crusaders often didn't even have the money to pay them back for the shipping, this way of profiting and also participating, contributing, for example, to the siege of Jerusalem. Right, at that point was allegedly some galleys dismantled by the peasants that allowed to build for the siege machinery to storm Jerusalem in the end. So much so that the Saint Godfrey of Bouillon tributed this honor to the Italians with an engraving that was later cancelled at the entrance of the palace of the government in Jerusalem. This is particularly important because it tells you how really present and pervasive this Italian presence really was. Or Italians were in the East before the Crusades and they were in the East after the Crusades. Nothing really changed. Venetian siege engineers were regularly contracted by Latin Mediterranean states, while the Genoese earned similar acclaim for their siege expertise. These maritime republics were, as we were saying before, extremely advanced in naval technology, ship building, armament in general, and so they had, just out of the sheer material wealth and very often the development of a very robust intelligentsia. These are the same places that, for example, go hunting for manuscripts in the East, in places where the same peoples that preserved them didn't even use them. The Italians knew perfectly where to find those and how to translate them, and they contributed to the recovery, reconstruction of Roman law, of the translation of many texts of science. This is happening actually Western Europe-wide. Also for those people who think that the West was just booming because it magically exposed, to Arabic or Greek translations. it's something that the Westerners did, while, say, the Greeks and the Arabs didn't really use those texts as the Westerners did it, to the extent that the Westerners had already developed a much more thriving literary, scientific, and cultural production at large on their own, right? So top-notch technology, especially in naval warfare, but as a consequence in everything concerning siege machinery, catapults, crossbows, apparently. That's something we'll have to tackle at some point, because it's an incredibly, as hotly debated topic during especially this era of the Crusades between the 11th and the 13th century. What was the actual influence of the Crusades and, say, Eastern technologies to the development of the Western ones, right? We know that Arabs' military engineers were employed as far as China. And it's not like China wasn't one of the most advanced powers in the world at the time, which makes you think. Equally, out of my experience, I've been studying this stuff for many years now. It doesn't seem to me that in the West you can really speak of the development of such military technologies as essentially an import from the East. They were essentially developing in parallel, and in many cases actually surpassing what already existed in the West in a way that in the East they didn't really quite have, unless we really do look at China and say, I don't know, what the Mongols brought from there during their invasions of Europe at Similia. It's not to say, I don't know, that the Arabs were not advanced, etc., but we often compared the developments of the Latin Germanic as opposed to the Turco-Arab civilizations, also the Byzantine one, and we observed, of course, the striking differences. The Westerners already from, say, the 12th century had surpassed whatever may have been more advanced than them. It's useful to understand the history of Venice like the one of any other Italian commune. As a matter of fact, this is really an official title that, as we were looking at in that video the other day, was paralleled by the official name of the city, government, etc. We've seen from many videos how the Italian communes essentially developed all with at the same time. They worked with the same stages. They were incredibly similar to one another, incredibly homogeneous in that, in this sense, very far from not constituting a whole, we can say, national reality, especially like in central, northern Italy. However, every community is also different, and Venice is evidently and possibly the most different of them all, right? And her documentation, in fact, is peculiar. I'm not going to digress now on that, because there is all a history. We can look about it in another video. However, we do not know too much about Venice in the way we know it for other communes. This in part can be explained with the fact that, aside from the various manuscript traditions, the way sources were preserved, the archives, histories, etc., Venice, by not being involved in the terra firma, did not really spark too much interest in some degree of political and territorial historical inquiry like other communes that were constantly battling one another, and so that we know in every single place in their district what kind of clash or siege there had been. So with Venice it's different. We realize that a Venetian army was already very well updated, possibly by a reform that had occurred at least by the 70s of the 12th century. Venice had, of course, an ancient military organization. It was historically the Duchy of Venice, hence the Dux Doge, as a matter of fact, which, as you know, was a more militarily loaded Byzantine official title that reflected, in fact, mostly a warlike function. And, of course, Venice had a military organization from very early on in the Middle Ages. That's why I said we can't simply talk about this now. However, the interesting aspect of the Venetian military is how, of course, Venice was not regularly involved into terrestrial operations to the degree other, or in the way at least, also in the degree but especially in the way other communes would, right? The idea of fielding major armies to defend herself from land was not a thing, right? They had their navy. Nobody could basically besiege Venice. And if anything, as we've seen, Venetian policy mostly aimed at surgically intervening in certain specific theaters for mostly seizing fortresses that it could resupply from the sea, because, if nobody else came to blockade that center from the sea, you couldn't really besiege it from land, because it wouldn't make sense. At least you could hope to storm it, of course, at some point, but it could keep being resupplied by the fleet. In any case, we understand that the Venetian communal army had a long-standing tradition that we can't unfortunately see too well, but it was there. And again, the Venetian army was pretty much the same as any other Italian communal one. We can enucleate three distinct segments of Venice's armed forces that, in the history of the art of war, actually seem to have been the first ones that neatly and clearly separated, not much at this time, but it's debatable, however, properly the notion of a navy, right, or a permanent navy really controlled by specific organisms of the state as opposed to the army. This is incredibly important. It tells you how advanced Venice was and why also she was so successful politically and militarily. They controlled very well the entire system. Now, of the three segments that we're talking about, the most vital was the so-called Forza Ordinaria, which means ordinary force or regular force, if you want. This consisted entirely of Venetian citizens, right? The citizens of the Venetian commune, aged 17, later adjusted to 20 to 60 years. So this is the general Romano-Germanic levy system of the able-bodied freemen in arms. That would have been so just by origin and activity as well, because as we all understand now, these people were autonomously, as privately active at sea on their own already. They had their own ships. It's all like in the other communes. There are some clans that control the commune with their clienteles, their assets. They're essentially a knightly class that has these other elements, lawyers, people, high status people, let's say, that eventually represent a point of reference for all the people workers. In some cases, not even just citizens, but just think all the people working in shipbuilding, involving trade, etc. These are the leaders of the system, those that will essentially constitute the Senate of Venice. Now, of this Forza Ordinaria, those summoned were grouped so that they could be, in theory, everybody, right? This able-bodied freemen, the general levy, and just a part of it would be regularly summoned, just like in the other communes. I made some videos about the Italian communal army organization, so you can check that out in comparison. And we know, at least organically speaking, that those summoned were grouped into units of 12, receiving payment for their required service, which was set at 2 to 6 weeks. This is very interesting because the history of sort of paid military service in the Italian community, it's a vexata question for many historiographical reasons. In any case, there were some compensation for your military service. This, we're talking already sort of statally advanced times, because before there would be some compensation system, but mostly these were, especially between the 11th and the 12th century, created for repaying knights, especially for the loss of their horses, right? Here we see something else, like this entire force paid when summoned, and for a service that could extend to 2 months, which in the period for a citizen force means a lot, since in other countries where this had been going on, mostly from the monetization of the previous feudal levy, things didn't go on that long. In fact, even in this case, however, depending on mostly the fact that these soldiers were paid, this service stretched longer, right? We've seen this in other videos about feudal armies organization. You are paid for a certain amount, but then there are reasons for which you may want to stay longer in the field, mostly political ones, especially if you're protected by the authority that here is able to sort of pay you and thus also reward you in other ways. In the case of Venice, by the way, this service was typically performed aboard ships, which set it a bit aside from practically any other power other than, as we've seen, this Italian maritime republics. But in the case of Venice, this is much more neatly and precisely regulated. It gives you an impression that Venice had a great care about the quality and motivation of her embarked troops so that they would be effective also far from home, by the way, even though at sea, movements were really less complicated than on land. Entailing, by the way, that also part of the naval, the equivalent naval service that did exist, like a naval levy, was subsidized by the state. As we were saying before, there was a central capacity to put together some ships. This was much easier, like in a logistical, strategic sense, to separately embark these troops while managing the fleet with its other, operational essence. The Army and the Navy came to be more neatly separated, but initially and for an important time, it wasn't really like that. By the late 13th century, the Forza Ordinaria were arranged in sets, as we've seen, of 12 called duodene, and which is essentially a platoon of sort, and used a lottery to establish their service sequence, indicating that usually only 1/12 of the fleet was active at a time, serving for a month. This is also quite interesting, because there wasn't necessarily a need, in fact, to just employ them, but to keep them readily available, right? This is incredibly important. Plus, it reinforces the notion that the Venetian citizenry was sort of less escapably involved into military operations, but also with a greater support from the state, right? In the Italian communes, this was an issue. We've seen it also in a video that analyzes, in fact, public debt in the Italian communes connected mostly with military expenses. However, Venice is just less escapable, also less pregnable, and it has more concentrated means. So equally, the citizenry is going to be more involved in everything that is happening there, regardless of the fact that there is a nobility that mostly runs the business and other people just follow in practice. Even during the Third Genoese War that we've seen exactly in the aforementioned video, we're talking 1350, just 3/12 were called up in a moment, by the way, of dire strait, yielding no more than 25 galleys. Right, numbers didn't have to be monstrous. By the way, galleys were incredibly costly. We'll talk about this better in a video about medieval ships' costs. But again, consider that in theory the reserves were in the hundreds of galleys. So it's really incredible. It's an immense force that, again, will just operate. Will always be there, privately owned, ready for war or not, but just satisfactory to provide with these tens of galleys that, again, barely any power can put at sea on a regular basis, let alone having it virtually always available, permanently available. This is, in fact, a very important aspect. There is a de facto permanent force at play here. This is very underrated for medieval standards, but when you transpose the costs, right, of these forces to, say, mid-14th century one, when we start saying, this is when the first nuclei of permanent forces really began. It's mostly just like the same thing, or even more, in the previous era, and the latter being mostly interpreted, set as a standard from a modernistic standpoint, and mostly just looks at the later Middle Ages and is convinced that everything gradually grows progressively. So before the later Middle Ages, things should have been worse. Instead, they were actually more functional before the mid-14th century crisis. In any case. Now, the men in each duodenum who remained at home contributed to the wages and equipment of those deployed, as in the usual rota system that the entire world had for their levies, their militias. The state mainly supplied the galleys, as we were hinting at before, but in certain cases, Venice's richer families could be compelled to provide galleys at their own expense, which would have been virtually the same thing in terms of quality served, with a number depending on their wealth, of course. This was the same in the other communes. This was true at large also for the other Italian maritime republics. But say this would define properly nobility in the Italian communes is how rich you are, right? If you can and will perform military service essentially on horseback, right? Which is like having just a private jet, right? A war horse, a stallion is something of that scale, costly wise. In fact, it's insane. These were the centuries in which cavalry was at its peak, by the way. So when we look at galleys, you realize that there was some sort of equivalent to that. Not just, obviously to the galley is not a horse, but to the idea that the upper echelon of society was just richer, was just more habituated to step in. And they were the same people that sat in the city councils to decide when to wage war, how, why, etc. In 1294, these families, in fact, were directed to outfit 1, 2, or 3 galleys each. It is really a lot. Together raising 60 to 70 ships, which is insane. Though only 4 families were wealthy enough to be expected to supply the maximum of 3 galleys. This was, again, an enormity, right? Fully fit galleys for combat. Arms, supplies, crews, the ship itself. Think about the costs. We have, by the way, from the Italian documentation, a very in-depth, detailed evidence of all what was needed to arm a ship. Right? We will study this at some point more in depth, because it gives you also the idea of all the people that worked to make that happen behind it. Right? Now, the Forza Ordinaria was typically reinforced by a secondary militia, the Forza Sussidiaria, the subsidiary forces, the auxiliary force, which included contingents from Istria, Dalmatia, and other dependent areas, as well as Venetians residing overseas, such as in Constantinople, Syria, Crete. Now, this is very interesting because, first of all, when we talk about militia, or better, milizia, whether in Italian or Latin, we're not talking, in fact, about the English concept of militia. We're talking literally about, say, if we talk milizia, it's a very specific term, also just in the broader Middle Ages, but even more in particular for the sake of recruitment in the Italian communes, that reflects properly the knightly class. All the people who could go at war as milites with, again, heavy armor, war horse, etc. So this militia, so to say, this recruitment system can be called militia if you, the English way, but remember that the upper echelon, it's the real milites, and down the line there are all other classes of recruitment that vary by equipment on the basis of the person's wealth. As always, this, we know it very well. This subsidiary force works exactly in the same way, but it is subsidiary, it is auxiliary, Exactly because these are not Venetian citizens, or at least in some cases they are, but they basically are recruited locally from the estates that they literally established in some places. I don't know, the same Crete, right? There would be Venetian families from Italy that lorded over the Byzantine peasants there, and they had their rocks, their castle, just as feudal lords in other countries. There's a very interesting history of the relation between Venice as a commune and these people, because technically, here's a bit complicated to explain because it's actually a very technical issue throughout Venetian history, but there was a level of course, of freedom entailed in the ancien regime essence of the commune as far as the free citizenry was concerned, right? Plus, consider that unlike other communes that have more or less their citizens inhabiting, say, possessing the land in the districts surrounding the city, here, this land may be literally overseas. Whether it's also Istria, it's near to Rome, or wherever in the Levant, it starts becoming more of a blurred picture. Even for those lands that are, at the end of the day, entirely conquered by Venice at some point, like Crete, right? So there is always a history of the Venetian functionaries from the mother city that began to control ever more the Venetians that had living abroad. In some other cases, these auxiliary forces are not Venetians. They may have had a broader connection with them, including blood, etc., but they came from literally other communities that joined, like other communes, by the way, Venice in some sort of auxiliary fashion. Imagine, I don't know, conceptually, the Romano-Italic Confederacy. There is Rome, that is the mother city, and then there are other communities that are basically taken over by Rome, but that are not essentially given full citizenship. They do not participate to the Roman government, but they still help, right? And of course, there is an inequality in this relation. Otherwise, Venice could have not even asked them to serve for her. So we're talking Istria, Dalmatia, all lands with very interesting history because of the historical Romance presence, especially on the coasts, but eventually the Slavization during the migration era, the Byzantine government from one side, and here basically the innerly expanding Venetian one within it, because there was always this ambiguity of, what was really Venice. Venice did not belong to the Holy Roman Empire, but at this point you can't say it belonged to the Byzantine one either. So there are these interesting identity overlappings, political associations that surely we will see better in other videos. And these forces will provide, in fact, on Venetian demand, their own forces. However, mostly crews and gear, which means that the Marines, so the troops that would have been embarked for terrestrial operations, and of course the Marines could do the same, the thing was blurred, were tended to be Venetian, which granted Venice, of course, a much greater control over the entire operations, simply disposing on these forces provided by the Allies. Venice, by the way, always also supplied the ships herself, dispatching with skeleton crews that had to be integrated by these auxiliary ones. For instance, in 1171, Istrian and Dalmatian towns were obligated to furnish crews for 10 ships. This contribution was compulsory, much like the service in the Forza Ordinaria. Indeed, all Venetians abroad could be recalled for military duty. Meaningfully enough, both the Ordinaria and Sussidiaria forces were made up solely of freemen. Again, they're not necessarily all Venetian citizens, but they are freemen, and they're chosen as such by Venice. Although prisoners of war were used as galley slaves, at least on one recorded occasion in 849. It is pretty early. Sporadically also by pirates during the period we're covering today. However, freemen remained, as we know, the norm until the late 15th century, when the Ottoman naval expansion triggers warfare in the Mediterranean, heightened by the religious tensions. So the fact that your prisoners of war wouldn't be either Christian but infidels from, in this case, the Venetian side, that could and would be employed as slaves, not as just prisoners of war, that were, however, recognized as freemen still, depending on who they were. Because we know it very well throughout this period, when you look at all these, for example, Italian fleets, the rowers were salaried freemen. And their job wasn't even that bad, telling you the truth. They were well paid, they had a lot of insurances, they were well treated, because they were also quite costly. And we will talk more about how galley warfare really happened, especially in these centuries, because we made some general overview, but as you know, also in antiquity at large, rowers were freemen. Now, this choice was driven less by kindness than by practicality, as slaves rowing would have severely undermined and did paralyze the fighting power of a galley, which by this era averaged about 200 crew members, roughly 180 of whom, including around 30 expert crossbowmen, often mercenaries, were oarsmen. The third segment of Venice's forces appeared primarily in emergencies. This was known as the Forza Straordinaria, composed of mercenaries hired on a short-term basis. Interestingly, Genoa, whose military framework closely paralleled Venice's, labeled her own paid citizens as mercenaries, and by the late 12th century, many in both Venice and Genoa chose to pay a fee similar to scutage to hire substitutes rather than serve personally. This was really typical to all the Italian communes. They were not really considered mercenaries the way we intended. Mostly the term was stipendiari, which means literally like troops that receive a stipendium. So it was really normal. It was based on the notion that, as we've seen, this service was not merely a compensation for the levy expenses, that, as we pointed out before, was a bit at the foundation of militia service in Venice. It literally was an extraordinary situation and job, right, where the commune said, okay, we need these many people to be paid for military service, this specific characteristics, and as such, there was a voluntary hiring, also from people that were not necessarily, of course, Venetian, and that would have simply done their job in that mansion. The Doge held supreme command, and in most significant campaigns led the fleet himself, though this practice declined as the 13th century wore on, in part because, as we've seen in that video about the mid-14th century, the Doge was gradually controlled by the Venetian Senate. A victorious admiral as a head of state sparked too many suspicions of possible coups, as we've seen in the one of Marine Faliero, for example. So, even though there were many great doge that had been, in fact, commanders at sea, on land, etc., in a practical sense, also to avoid a political paralysis in case they had to die. By the way, in combat, they would remain in Venice, where sounder, colder decision could be taken, regarding what was happening, also, of course, overseas, so that wasn't necessarily the best choice, but at least the political control was more important than even the military performance, because it allowed, in any case, to intervene with further means from home when things went wrong. And in any case, the Venetians, as we see, knew their deal. They had good commanders, they had good troops. Beneath the Doge, prominent officers from patrician families bore titles like Ammiratus, which was in fact admiral, or Capitanus or Capimastro, that is, captain. In Venice, a captain commanded a fleet, with an admiral as the overarching leader beside him. In Genoa, a captain managed fleets of fewer than 10 ships, while an admiral oversaw 10 or more. Since, as we've seen, the 10s were normally the average operational, say, operative scale of naval forces, number of galleys, probably. Masters of individual ships were known as padroni, that is to say, probably the owners, or from the 13th century, comiti, so counts, though comito specifically referred to masters of galleys and oared vessels, not sailing ships. Speaking of the fleet strength, the largest credible fleets of this period numbered around 200 ships. This is insane. Again, the sheer size of this is basically not... Of course, there are some powers that can't put together as many ships. At some point, this had already happened, of course, in the Middle Ages. But consider that here, Venice could do it on... If, pressed, of course, they could have not sustained this for a long time themselves, but they were ready to put that together in cases of emergency. At least probably in the full period here, especially in the 13th century. In fact, until that moment, these fleets often comprised a notable proportion of transports as well, and merchant vessels doubling as warships. We will talk about this too at some point, because what's the difference in medieval history between, warships and transport cargoes, etc. Of course, there was even a ship design divergence increasing over time, but essentially everything at this point that you could put soldiers on, also considering that merchant vessels, as a regular precaution, were armed, right, and their crews would fight, in fact, in case of need. You can argue that, depending also on the general, the type of operation, the type of action, things could simply adapt to it. Ideally, galleys were the most maneuverable type of ship. They were conceived as particular for naval warfare, but there were also other models now that were more typically functioning as transports and merchant vessels. They could be armed as well anyway, so you can't quite draw a radical line between the two. Now, the true number of dedicated war galleys was thus lower, likely capping at about 100 until the early 13th century, which is already a lot, by the way. In 1171, 100 galleys and 20 transports were outfitted, while 50 to 62 galleys in the Fourth Crusade represented half of Venice's total capacity. This was the other strategic and operational deal. You could have multiple fleets operating at the same time. Imagine all the gamble that existed behind this, like all the political debates regarding where to hit, where to strike, and again, without properly a history of a campaign, of an actual war, it's difficult even to appreciate how sophisticated medieval politics and warfare really was at sea as well. By the end of our period here, fleet sizes had undeniably expanded. This was really typical also for Italian land armies. We've seen it in different videos. The Italians, especially towards the end of the 13th century, are starting to field regularly on just, on a Lombard or a Tuscan or a Veneto-based armies of 30,000 men. At times, again, armies of tens of thousands operating at the same time during the same season on different theaters. The causes are many. We have mostly dealt with them in the videos about Italian financial and maritime hegemony, their banking, their military development, etc. So here we are at the peak of the great medieval civilization. A lot of trade is really working smoothly like never before. In 1298, during the Second Genoese War, 1294-1299, a Venetian fleet of over 100 galleys was recorded at the Battle of Curzola, and the following year, another fleet of 100 galleys was assembled. Again, insane, especially considering, again, the additional cost of the ship. So even if you multiply this, as we'll see now, for the number of crewmen for each, like it's a very big amount of troops, even larger than land armies, or maybe the equivalent, because very often for those we can't see how many other people revolved around armies of 30,000 fighters. Instead, through the ships and their types, you can sort of understand part of it, but in general, the information is sketchy. Like, we don't know, we know a lot, especially about Italian warfare, but about Venice, as we've seen, a bit less. And in general, it's always like, I don't know, there was this amount of, they didn't make the math for you about the grand total of troops or whatever. So it's mostly very patient research, the only way to a full reconstruction. I personally never studied Venetian armies in that depth. I fear it's more difficult than it seems, because again of the scarcity of information in general, but through a massive comparative work, serious, like a PhD research could be adequate for that. A good doctorate, 3 years researching on this stuff. But it's just like naval history to be treated differently by the narrative sources that are, at the end of the day, the sap of it. Maybe archive sources, yes, can render an idea of something, but not of too much. We know here, you will see that the numbers more or less, but we just go by analogy, which can be fairly consistent as a method in this case, but not quite the ultimate proof explainer. The capacity to launch such substantial fleets, 2 years running, by the way, while maintaining regular trade flotillas and smaller squadrons elsewhere, suggests Venice's total strength in the century's closing years was, we're talking the 13th century, at least 150 galleys, possibly as high as 200. So we're talking warships, right? Strikingly, Genoa kept 165 in 1295, crewed by 35,000 men. So we're talking about, at least making the maths out of this, about 212 men per galley, which means also pretty crowded galleys. That suggests also a great deal of, deck combat, as a matter of fact. Because today we would not explain that, but we talked here and there about galley warfare, and of course, boarding was the preferential tactic, right? They weren't simply bombarding one another, as they did at a distance. They had to close in, because there weren't other ways to knock out an enemy ship. This is quite important, considering the effectiveness of Italian forces this time in history, you would have had the same kind of troops, the knights dismounted naturally, operating on these galleys decks. We're talking about specialized infantry. Surely this kind of deck combat would have been potentially more individual. And of course, you wouldn't have the large formations of pikemen that the Italians had at this point on land to levels that weren't seen even in the Renaissance at some point in terms of collective training, numbers, and so on. And this is also very much neglected. Of course, it was a different type of tactic from the pike square, but was an insane level of collective training and overall performance. Venice's army proved just as formidable as her navy, despite jests that the marsh-dwelling Venetians lacked equestrian skill, which in fact was not really true. Of course, there isn't too much you can breed in Venice, but Venice controlled other territories, and they could import the horses. They could train in some spaces. By the 13th century, Italian states' armies, including Venice's, incorporated mercenaries from various regions alongside a feudal lord's personal retinue, or masnada. So the typical army organization, as we've seen before, the 13th century is a moment of great monetization of military service. We made lots of videos about this in the past. So the composition of Venetian land forces would have equated to one of other armies at the time. It wasn't even just about Italian ones. More or less, these were Western armies that were mounted knights, and probably some kind of lighter type of horsemen that, however, especially at this point, wasn't that prevalent. Venice had an early connection with the Balkans. Think about the Stradiots later on. And so we can think even mounted crossbowmen. They would have had in the West already. The Italian communes paid for, 1/10 of the cavalry to be mounted crossbowmen. Professionals, just as other crossbowmen's units on foot for the infantry. And that was, in fact, the numerical bulk of it all. Proportions varying, really 1-5 would have been really normal. Cavalry to infantry, even though in some cases could be more. Doesn't seem that the Venetian organic was particularly imbalanced towards infantry. However, it may have been, as a matter of fact. At least the few I've seen in my studies does suggest so, but also because Venice normally operated on difficult terrain, say coastal areas, in fact marshes, mostly involved in sieges, so they didn't need to descend in open field to make the big showdown. But this does not mean, of course, that they wouldn't use cavalry as all the other Western armies. And in fact, we know from their arms and armor that they were identical. Early in the 13th century, most Venetian troops were still drawn from the lagoon area, considered that. So they were really a pretty militarily active community, supplemented by a few feudal contingents from Dalmatian Istria, as we've seen before. Regents also tapped for the forza sussidiaria. Even into the 14th century, Venice favored these local conscripts and volunteers over mercenaries, proving that the civic participation to the army was deeply felt within, again, one of the most better organized city-states, in this case with a republican yet oligarchic form of government that ensured pretty high standards and also important levels of control, as we've seen of the same citizenry, but also the surrounding communities that at large, of course, would have not supported Venice hadn't they had essentially something to gain from it, including being part of this incredibly wealthy trade network that the Serenissima controlled. So as we've seen, the majority of troops fought as infantry, wealthier men or noble served as cavalry. This was, again, the norm like in all the other Italian city-states. A 1338 register estimates that 30,000 Venetians were capable of bearing arms. Just like you see in Milan, in Florence, in any major Italian center, in fact at this point was becoming more or less the major pole, right, of Italian politics. In this year, for example, this year there was the Venetian Florentine Scaliger War, where actually Venice and Florence hired basically just mercenaries. Putting money in common, Venice was in charge of properly the logistics, the operations, because they were fighting in Veneto against the Veronese, the Scaligers. So Florence was more distant, Venice was next door. This was a war triggered, again, by the control over certain salt depots in the Paduan district that is just inland to the Venetian one in the west. All reasons that we will see better in another video. There had been, other Venetian interventions, the War of Ferrara, for example, which the Venetians were beaten, by the way. In any case, here we're not talking about these mercenaries, we're talking about citizens. So 30,000 is what is expected to the citizenry. Which is interesting because in the same years, as you can see by the employ of mercenaries in practical wars, here we're just looking at what was expected from the citizenry. The same is going on, in fact, in Milan and Florence. In theory, there was a citizen army, a communal force, that, however, exactly in this decade was fading because of the crisis of the later Middle Ages. So the Milanese were, in theory, capable of fielding 30,000 men. But in practice, they would just prefer to hire mercenaries, getting money from the various subjected communities. In fact, sparing the citizenry from this military service that could make them even dangerous for the increasingly oligarchic government. And it was just the temper of the era that witnessed the exhaustion, probably of the will to participate, to military operations all across Eurasia. You have the same identical picture. It's a well-studied phenomenon. Infantry also lost importance, as you know, towards the mid 14th century. There wasn't at all an increasing, linear increase in the importance of infantry during the later Middle Ages. Was very much ups and downs. But the mere fact that we can track for 1338 this 30,000 requirement, which for other cities really stops being documented meaningfully, also for the production, the general production, general activity, from an administrative, political point of view, concerning this army's organization, suggests us that these 30,000 were not like an undisciplined mob. No army at the time really ever was. We have a bit of a strange idea of medieval armies to begin with, and again, especially the Italian ones were arguably the best of the period. But again, in this period, something more. We don't really have a major Venetian land clash in this era. We have the siege of Zara, we have the employment, in fact, of forces of that in that scale. The Venetians would pay up to 1 million ducats for that siege. The ducat was equivalent to a florin. We know that was the normal expenses also for other armies, but again, first of all, less documentation. Secondly, however, no major real engagement showdown. Like, there are massive battles in the Italian hinterland at this point, like, I don't know, Montecatini, Alto Pascio. We're talking about 30,000 versus 20,000, something like that, right? With Venice, we simply don't have that, right? And again, it's not random. It's perfectly obvious considering the fact that it didn't get involved into land warfare. The army used against the Scaligers at some point was pretty big, but it was mostly based already on the Barbute, and so this proportion towards lots of, say, several thousand men at arms, like the Milanese had, etc. So it wasn't the age of many infantrymen anymore. But we understand that Venice could have been capable of fielding this, possibly more than those sort of inland forces that had transitioned to this sort of more elite professional elements, not just because of the generalized crisis, but likely because it was also easier for them, considering the threats coming from the open theater in general. Venice did not really have this problem. What were these troops in general? We said it before, there were specialized infantry types. Cavalry was pretty much standard, again, aside from some mounted missile, etc. Like, it was normal also. In the rest of Europe, we do not have reason to... But by the 14th century, basically all men-at-arms in Europe look the same, at least from Portugal to Poland, from Norway to Sicily. They're identical. The Venetians are very updated, technologically speaking. There is this notion we were talking about before that the maritime republics were better at crossbows. This is essentially stemming from the fact that there was a lot of missile exchange before boarding, and that, as we've seen, these maritime republics were very much into technical stuff and sieges, and so they would have clever ways to adapt any kind of technology also to their rank and file missile troops. The skill was noted among the Forza Ordinaria's oarsmen as well, while others wielded slings and fire grenades as well. In the 14th century, the most navally advanced countries are Venice and the Mamluks, for that matter. We talked about the latter sort of pyrotechnics as well, so to say. They had literally torpedoes, right? And both powers used explosive shells that, as we were talking about the other day, for the video about, it was about the history of artillery. They existed ever since firearms were introduced. But the Venetians were really the best for this. We shall make more videos to look in depth at how true that was. Because, again, you can be very advanced technologically wise, but not necessarily being sort of the best in other fields. My impression is that, of course, the Venetians would have had this kind of very high technical capacity, but that, as we've seen, since they were not really interested in terrestrial operations more than much, they wouldn't even properly try to invest too much in any kind of broader doctrinal tactical capacity. Consider that if, in the 14th century especially, the wealth that the Venetians and the Genoese were spending in naval warfare had been invested in land warfare, we do not know where Italy would have gotten that, because it's an astronomical cipher. However, the fact that this didn't happen still shows us that it was more remunerative to be at sea, controlling traffics and struggling, in fact, for the control of those routes, than any other process. Then, when in the 15th century Venice expands on the terra firma, arrives a few tens of kilometers from Milan, that also spoke volumes about the Venetian capacity to create a vast land dominion, and also literally the best army of the era, together with the Burgundians, out of sheer will power. So this is sort of a different story. We know that Venice maintained, of course, a small professional infantry unit to guard key castles like Mestre and Treviso that are inland to Venice. Mestre is just sort of next door in the north. Treviso is also taken over later, at least it's controlled. We'll have to talk more about these centers. But it was obvious that garrisons were needed to be constantly maintained, so with also professional troops that would make, as we've seen, the bulk of Venetian forces in these attempts. The Venetian Florentine war against Verona was essentially an important step further. The Venetians after that would never really leave the terra firma, regardless of the fact that up to this point was and also beyond this would be a small territory until the 15th century. We do not see for these garrisons Venetian cavalry, but it would have existed, right? I don't think that there is any reason why this would have not been the case. Again, the notion that the Venetians did not use as much cavalry as the other Italian communes doesn't make any sense, right? It's just Venice is not very much out there. Actually, because we're talking standing, right? So again, Venice could hire the best men-at-arms, like against Verona. This was mostly German mercenaries, by the way, that later even fought against Milan. Also because they simply disbanded them. They didn't care what they would do, because they didn't control the interland, so who cared, right, from a Venetian perspective? That's not standing, but it's virtually, for years, operating in against the Veronese countryside. And so it is as if, and that's what we were talking about before regarding permanent forces. What are they really, right? So overall, we're looking at a pretty normal picture, what you would really expect. By the way, there were, of course, richer Venetian citizens or aristocrats when needed that would provide with very good cavalry forces. We will look at these units better in other videos, also to document the lavish but sort of updated, not just Venetian but Italian armament, especially throughout all the period, telling the truth, but increasingly so. I made a video about Italian warfare between the 11th to the 14th century. You can check that out, because there is stuff from Venice to there. Today, we technically stop just to the 13th century. In any case, the broader picture is the one of a power that, for these centuries in particular, does not get too much involved on land, without this, of course, having anything to do with any doctrinal change. Western European armies in particular were all the same. We don't have any evidence that they could vary. Like, of course, in the Italians, they had larger infantry bodies at large, but also just because they had large armies, apparently. So in proportion to cavalry, that is also relatively debatable. If anything, it's the quality that matters, and it's just the same type of trooper you would see elsewhere, which is slightly debated. At least the pikemen especially were a thing. The Italians developed the pavesiers earlier in some ways. They had better crossbowmen, but at least conceptually those things were all already there since ever. At least they developed in a way that, especially for infantry warfare, Italians maximized. And again, their cavalry was just like the others as well. So this is really like the broader picture. We will surely talk about more in-depth specific evidence, because as I was saying in the video I made about mid 14th century Venice, we actually haven't talked about Venetian history that much. And here, again, all of a sudden it happens in Schwerpunkt. We have, 3 videos in a row about that. What doesn't come up before will later. This is really, really normal. I'm glad to talk about Venetian history, because it's one of those exceptions, if you want, that test your what is the point also of our channel from a conceptual point of view. There is nothing rigidly structural or categorical about certain differences or how certain peoples fight or not. It just must be understood in its inherent logic. right? One that has a still must maintain how this difference is not essential, but it rests on a basis that is essentially what you have to first look at. Knowing how things really work, you can't look at little differences. There are little, of course, they are big, they are important. It's not to say that they weren't important, but they were less relevant than the substance that lay at the basis. And if anything, again, what really stands out for Venice, it's her political control, her military organization. It's very steady. It's very unlike most governments at this point, and quite unique. And in that case, really being mostly the product of a political, a moral, cultural reason, more than, in fact, any deterministic one as well. That's where you have to look at for such differences. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.